for inviting me. I don't know how I can follow the previous act. This is going to be extremely low energy and in comparison, but I'll do what I can. And in fact, it's even worse than you might think because I'll be basically going through a timeline, as I think the way in which many of these, the current rebellions, if you will, in tech dovetail is extremely complex. And even I, putting this timeline together, was a bit surprised at how some things overlapped. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so essentially I'd like to share a cautiously optimistic timeline of the various ethical and human rights rebellions that are currently happening in tech. I'm going to focus primarily on the last 6 months. Things have very much accelerated, but I think in order to bookend some of the current events, it's useful to go a little bit earlier into the beginning of 2017, in particular with some actions that happened at Uber that many people could even say largely supported much of the Me Too movement. Okay, so again, I'll apologize if I'm overemphasizing my role. I definitely believe in movement-driven leaders, not leader-driven movements, but at the same time, I'd like to explain what it is that my experience was. Okay, so also I'm going to leave out a bunch of important things that have happened, in particular some issues related to Microsoft having contracts with immigrations and customs. And there was a lot of protests against that. Amazon supplying facial recognition software to police and ICE as well as a bunch of recent protests against Salesforce having a Customs and Border Patrol contract. Okay, so rough timeline, I think, again, I would start February 2017. I think most people are pretty familiar with Susan Fowler's post. There was about 3,000 words in early 2017 detailing the sexual harassment that happened in Uber, in particular her experiences with it. This arguably is what kicked off a lot of the large impacts in tech. It ultimately led to the ousting of the CEO of, at that time, what was about a $70 billion company. Now I believe they're valued at about $120 billion. So it's no minor action, I think, to have kicked off such a large change in such a big company, essentially with words. So December 2017, I think most people are familiar with a lot of the silence breakers being given the award of being Time Persons of the Year. Susan Fowler was one of these people. Soon after this was announced, Microsoft actually proactively ended forced arbitration for sexual harassment claims. So maybe it's a little less known that when Susan Fowler was raising a lot of these issues in numerous articles that she wrote, her number one demand was that there should be an end to forced arbitration. So effectively, if you had a sexual harassment claim, rather than being able to take it to the courts, you were forced to go through the company's process. This is no minor issue. Even though she had called for this at Uber, it was actually first Microsoft that stepped up to the plate and ended it. I'll come back to that because one could actually argue today is kind of the end of this in the tech industry. Okay, March 2018, jumping forward, news broke of a project for Google to actually be building, it's called AI for drone warfare. So there was a contract through the Pentagon to build effectively a way to triage large amounts of footage from drone surveillance in order to better, let's say, direct the time of the people watching the footage. There was also explicit software built for explicitly tracking vehicles, which therefore would lead to tracking of people. I think understandably a lot of Google engineers were very upset by this type of software being developed within their company. So April 4th, 2018, a letter that was written by Google engineers was published in the New York Times. I'd say the punchy part of the letter was a statement that Google should not be in the business of war. It had over 3,000 signatures and essentially two asks. One of them was to immediately cancel this project, which was called Project Maven immediately. The other was for Google to publicly state that it would not participate in war, and neither would any of its contractors in the future. So it turns out that this demand was to some degree met a few months later. But in the meantime, May 2018, Uber and Lyft actually ended forced arbitration for sexual harassment. And I think we're all aware the Me Too movement has been continually building. And so I think a lot of these pressures ended up tipping some of these actions. And then June 1st, Google promises not to renew Maven, but it did continue working on the contract. And then June 7th, there was actually a response to the asks from the letter that was published in the New York Times, which was that Google publicly released a set of AI principles. I'd say the meat of the AI principles was essentially 4 statements. One of them that I think is the most important, which is that they promised not to design or deploy technologies whose purpose contravenes widely accepted principles of international law or human rights. It turns out while this was being drafted, they were actively building projects that completely disagreed with these statements, but that wasn't public at the time, and I'll come back to that. Okay, so the AI principles were released. It turns out that this Project Maven effort was, part of the way that it was kind of dismissed initially was that it was said to only be a $9 million contract. So for a company like Google, that's pretty tiny. But the goal was actually to ramp up to a $250 million contract. And in fact, the next stage of it was to bid on a $10 billion project called the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure Project, which was effectively to provide the cloud for the Department of Defense. So as part of that JEDI effort in June 21st, a group of 9 engineers within Google actually had decided to withhold their labor and refuse to build some of the key technology that would be required for Google to win that contract. In particular, what they refused to build was an air-gapped version of cloud. So if anybody's not familiar with an air-gap, it's effectively like a computer that's not connected to an internet, which turns out to be an important component of a lot of defense computing. I don't think that group of 9 was given quite enough credit. August 1st, another scandal breaks, which is where maybe I come into this. News of Google building a proactively censored and surveilled version of its search engine for China gets publicized in The Intercept. It's kind of, takes a lot of people by surprise, myself included. Google has a culture where it at least pretends to be very open about what it's building internally. And so to be sideswiped by something of this magnitude is kind of incredible. It turns out 2 engineers that had worked on the project and who had been transferred off of it then started speaking internally about it in some Google Plus posts, perhaps one of the few places it's still used. And they actually stated that all of the leaks were, that's actually how bad the situation was. The leaks were not exaggerated. I found that very disturbing. It's one thing to see it in the press. It's another thing to see your fellow engineers saying it really is as bad as it sounds. So over the next 2 weeks, things escalated very quickly. People started internally investigating what was going on. A lot of the project was meant to be locked down, but a lot of the things that were meant to be locked down leaked. For example, it was found, and I personally witnessed a blacklist that contained the terms human rights, student protests, Nobel Prize, even, to tie things into today, as well as Mandarin terms for the leadership of the Communist Party in China, such as numerous terms containing Xi Jinping. There was explicit code to censor air quality data so that only the Chinese government could provide that. I guess, long story short, for the sake of time, after the New York Times live tweeted the first company-wide meeting on this, all internal discussion was essentially shut down. Someone went up to the microphone and actually said, "Fuck you, leaker," to the entire of the company. And as a response to this happening, I submitted a 2 weeks notice that I distributed throughout the company. That then caused an escalation up to my interface to the CEO, which was the head of AI research at Google, whose name is Jeff Dean. Very progressive sounding person if you check his Twitter. So I was very excited to speak with him. Right before the meeting, 14 human rights organizations drafted a letter stating their opposition to Dragonfly. I essentially brought the letter to the meeting. It was dismissed out of hand. I was told that the US is just as bad as China due to FISA warrants, so unless I think the US should also, or Google should also withdraw from the US, then I shouldn't complain about China. The next day, I turned in my badge and my laptop with the company. 2 weeks later, I spoke to The Intercept, made my resignation letter public. I guess we'll skip ahead. I wrote a letter to Congress that actually led to Ted Cruz really heavily questioning the chief privacy officer of Google, who then pleaded ignorance of the project and further refused to admit that China even censors its citizens. A few days later, 2 weeks later, Mike Pence openly condemned Project Dragonfly. October 8th, Google withdraws from this $10 billion cloud project, which I think is just unbelievable victory. That would be the capstone, except then November 1st, the Google walkout happened, which is arguably the biggest organized labor action in modern history. 20,000 employees at Google walked out over 50 offices. About a week later, Google ends forced arbitration, tying things back to Susan Fowler. The next day, Facebook joins in. 3 days later, Square, Airbnb, eBay join as well and also end forced arbitration. Skipping forward, today CBS News reported that effectively tech has just ended forced arbitration. So I think that's a nice bookend for the discussion. I'll sort of, I'm going over time, so I'll say I think what's important going forward is to understand that there's a huge battle right now, which is what is the framing of activism in tech. I think some smart people have noticed that there's essentially a hierarchy, which is human rights is greater than ethics is greater than politics. To push back a little bit on even the title of this event today, I'd say that human rights is actually well-defined. Even ethics isn't well-defined. And so the CEOs are trying as hard as they can to frame all activism in tech as a vocal minority that are just expressing their political opinions. And I think it's important to push back on that as much as possible and to point out concrete human rights violations. Otherwise, we're going to end up with vague discussions that are just treated as mere politics. Thank you.